Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
I'd always dreamed of getting away from the chaos of my life, even if just for a few days. That's how I ended up on the Forgotten Dunes Trail in the Pacific Northwest, a place I'd heard about in whispers, lauded for its breathtaking isolation. I wasn't much of an outdoorsy person, but the idea of hiking a remote stretch of coastline completely alone sounded like the perfect escape. No emails, no deadlines, no people, just me and the wild. I'd borrowed a weathered hiking pack from a friend and loaded it with the basics: a tent, some canned food, a cheap flashlight, and my phone. I didn't bother bringing a map since I had GPS. The plan was simple: hike 3 days in and loop back. Easy enough. The first day felt like stepping into a postcard. Towering cliffs framed by emerald waves, golden sand stretching endlessly before me, and the occasional cries of gulls cutting through the breeze. My feet sank with every step in the soft sand, but it didn't matter. The air smelled clean and salty, and the rhythm of the waves crashing against the shore was almost meditative. That night, I pitched my tent on a high ridge above the beach, far enough from the waterline to feel safe. I fell asleep to the sound of waves and the occasional rustle of wind through the nearby brush. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. Then, something woke me. At first, it was subtle, a faint scraping noise outside the tent. My groggy brain assumed it was wind dragging debris across the sand, but as I came to, I realized the sound was too deliberate. It wasn't random. It was steady, rhythmic, and uncomfortably close. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling in the stillness. The scraping stopped. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The moon cast pale light across the dunes, painting long shadows in the distance. I scanned the ridge, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Convincing myself it was just a curious animal or the wind, I zipped up the tent and laid back down. Sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. The trail seemed quieter somehow. The endless blue sky from the day before was now a dull gray, and a creeping fog had settled in, blurring the horizon. The beach looked the same, yet different. By late afternoon, the fog grew thicker, swallowing the landscape around me. My GPS started glitching, and I realized I was no longer on the main trail. My phone's battery was at 15%. I tried retracing my steps, but the dunes all looked identical in the haze. Then, I saw someone. A figure loomed just at the edge of visibility, its shape hazy through the fog. Relief washed over me and I waved. "Hey, over here!" I called out, jogging toward them. But they didn't move. They just stood there, unmoving, almost unreal. "Do you need help?" I shouted. No response. I froze, unsure of what to do. My instinct screamed to walk away, but my curiosity, stupid, dangerous curiosity, urged me forward. I took a cautious step closer, and just like that, the figure seemed to vanish into the mist. I stood there, staring into the empty space where they'd been, my skin crawling. That night I camped far inland, abandoning the beach for the supposed safety of the dunes. I built a small fire, its flickering light casting eerie shadows that danced across the sand. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined the figure, but every creak of the brush and whisper of the wind felt like a warning. Around midnight I heard it again, the scraping. This time it was louder, closer. Gripping the cheap knife from my pack, I stepped outside the tent. The fog had thickened, and the fire was barely a smoldering glow. I scanned the dunes with my flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the haze. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They circled my tent, fresh in the sand. My heart felt like it was about to burst as I turned the flashlight in every direction, looking for the person who'd made them. And then, in the corner of my eye, I caught movement. A shadow slipping between the dunes. I shouted, more out of fear than bravery, but there was no response. By morning, I was done. I packed up my gear and started walking, desperate to find the trailhead. My phone was dead, my water nearly gone, and every sound felt like something, or someone, following me. Hours passed before I finally stumbled upon a clearing where a group of hikers was resting. My relief was overwhelming as I explained in a shaky voice that I'd gotten lost. When I reached civilization, I told the local authorities everything. They listened politely but dismissed my story as the ramblings of a disoriented hiker. Exhaustion, they said, dehydration, hallucinations. But I know what I saw. Weeks later, I came across a news article about strange occurrences on the Forgotten Dunes Trail. Abandoned campsites, reports of figures in the fog, and hikers who swore they weren't alone. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I've replayed it over and over in my head, searching for answers. All I know is I'll never go back to that trail, or any trail, alone again. The Santa Cruz Mountains had always fascinated me. Towering redwoods, whispering streams, and an overwhelming sense of solitude. For someone like me who thrived on moments of quiet introspection, they felt like the perfect retreat. After months of urban chaos, I planned a solo weekend hike. I carefully packed everything I might need: water, snacks, a compact tent, and a map that outlined a scenic route through Wilder Ranch State Park. The first day was mesmerizing. The air was crisp, carrying a faint scent of pine and damp earth, while sunlight dappled through the canopy like nature's stained glass. I passed a handful of hikers exchanging polite nods before disappearing into the stillness. By late afternoon, I was completely alone, which was precisely what I wanted. I pitched my tent near a gentle stream as the sun sank behind the horizon. The forest seemed to hold its breath in the twilight, save for the occasional call of an owl or a faint rustle in the leaves. As darkness enveloped the woods, an uneasy quiet settled over the clearing. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar sounds of nature playing tricks on my nerves. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up abruptly. My heart hammered in the silence, but I couldn't immediately pinpoint why I was so alert. Then I heard it. A soft crunching sound like footsteps on fallen leaves coming from outside the tent. My throat tightened. "Hello?" I called out, forcing my voice to stay steady. The noise stopped, leaving only the chirping of distant crickets. I rationalized it as a deer, or maybe a raccoon, but the weight of the steps had sounded heavier, human even. I stayed still, gripping my flashlight like a weapon, straining to hear anything more. Minutes passed, maybe longer, before I convinced myself to let my guard down and slipped into a restless sleep. The following morning, an unease clung to me like a shadow. As I trekked further into the woods, I began noticing strange details along the trail. Scattered patches of disturbed soil, as though someone had dragged something through the underbrush. I dismissed it at first, thinking it could be wildlife. But then I spotted a boot print in the dirt, clear and fresh. It didn't match mine. A prickle of anxiety crept over me. I quickened my pace, but the forest began to change. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining to block out the light, and the path became harder to follow. The once welcoming woods now felt oppressive, as if they were conspiring to trap me. By the time afternoon rolled around, I decided to cut my hike short. I veered off the trail, hoping to find a faster route back to my car. That's when I stumbled upon it, a hidden campsite. At first glance, I thought it was abandoned. There were no tents, no sleeping bags, just a chaotic pile of tattered clothes and bones. My stomach churned as I realized they were animal bones, strung together into crude, unsettling ornaments, hanging from the branches above. Before I could process the scene, a sharp crack behind me froze me in place. Slowly I turned. About 20 feet away, a man stood, partially obscured by the trees. His clothes were filthy and torn, his face hidden behind a scruffy beard and wild, unkempt hair. But it was his eyes that unnerved me the most, sharp and predatory, fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Hey, I stammered, forcing a weak smile. I was just passing through. He didn't respond. He didn't even blink. He just stood there, watching me like a hawk sizing up its prey. My instinct screamed at me to leave. Slowly I backed away, keeping my eyes on him. He remained still, his gaze never wavering. When I was far enough, I turned and ran. Branches snagged at my clothes, the forest a blur as I sprinted through the underbrush. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. Every noise felt amplified. The crunch of my footsteps, the snap of twigs. And then I heard it. Footsteps. He was following me. I ducked behind a tree, trying to steady my frantic breathing. Peering out cautiously, I saw him again. He was closer this time, moving deliberately, scanning the area like a predator searching for its cornered prey. In his hand was something sharp. A knife. I stayed motionless, barely daring to breathe. He moved past me, and I seized the opportunity to creep in the opposite direction. Every step felt painfully loud, but I had no choice. My only thought was to make it back to my car. When the trees thinned and I spotted the parking lot, relief flooded through me. My car was in sight, but so was he. He stood at the lot's edge as if waiting for me. Adrenaline took over. I broke into a full sprint. He noticed me immediately and started running too, his knife glinting in the fading light. My keys were already in my hand by the time I reached the car. I yanked the door open, jumped in, and locked it just as he reached the passenger side. He slammed his fist against the window, the knife scraping menacingly against the glass. My hands shook as I started the engine, but I didn't hesitate. Slamming the car into reverse, I peeled out of the lot, leaving him standing there in the dust. I reported the encounter to the park rangers and the local police, but they didn't seem to take it seriously. They suggested he might be a drifter or someone living off the grid, but I knew better. That man wasn't just surviving out there. He was hunting. Even now I can't step into a forest without looking over my shoulder. His eyes haunt me in my dreams, burning with something far darker than desperation, something I'll never forget. The air was crisp as I stepped out of the car, the faint smell of pine mingling with the earthy scent of the forest floor. I'd always loved the sense of freedom hiking brought me, and after weeks of long hours and city noise, I was desperate for the escape. This trip wasn't about the views or the exercise, it was about solitude. I'd picked a little-known trail deep in the Allegheny Mountains, one that promised the quiet I craved. It was mid-November, and the golden hues of fall still clung stubbornly to the trees, though a chill warned of winter's approach. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. The trail wound through towering oaks and maples, their leaves crunching underfoot as I walked. The only sounds were the occasional chatter of squirrels and the distant call of a bird. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing near a slow-moving stream and decided to set up camp. The water shimmered under the fading light, and the quiet was so profound it was almost hypnotic. That night, as I lay in my tent staring up at the fabric ceiling, I thought, this is exactly what I needed. I woke abruptly sometime in the night. At first I wasn't sure why, but then I heard it, a faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone knocking on a hollow log. I froze, holding my breath as I strained to listen. It wasn't wind or the natural creaks of the forest. This was purposeful. Heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the gentle ripple of the stream. Nothing. Relieved but uneasy, I settled back into my sleeping bag, convincing myself it had been an animal. But when I stepped outside at dawn, I found something that made my stomach twist. A small stack of flat stones, carefully balanced right in front of my tent. I hadn't put them there. I stared at it for a long time, trying to rationalize. Maybe another hiker had come by, though I hadn't seen a soul all day. Or maybe it was just a coincidence, a natural occurrence I hadn't noticed before. I brushed it off and continued my hike, but the tension lingered. As I moved further along the trail, I noticed more of those stacks, each one spaced perfectly apart. The symmetry was unnerving. They weren't random, and they definitely weren't natural. Still, I told myself not to overthink it. I wasn't about to let some strange prank ruin my trip. That night I set up camp earlier, hoping to settle in before dark. I chose a spot with a clear view of the trail, thinking it would make me feel safer. As I sat by the small fire I'd built, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. The usual rustling of leaves and calls of nocturnal animals were absent, replaced by a thick, oppressive silence. I tried to shake off the unease, but when the fire died down, I found myself clutching my flashlight and knife, unwilling to sleep. It must have been after midnight when I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, circling the tent. My blood turned cold. They weren't heavy enough to be a bear, and they were too measured to belong to a deer. They were human. My heart hammered as I called out, "Who's there?" My voice trembled despite my efforts to sound firm. The steps stopped. I sat there in the dark, gripping my knife so tightly my knuckles ached, waiting for what felt like an eternity. But nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. By morning, I was done. I packed up as quickly as I could and started back toward the trailhead, my nerves on edge with every sound. The forest felt different now, like it was watching me. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, and the silence was suffocating. Then I saw him. He stood just off the trail, half hidden behind a tree. His clothes were filthy, his face gaunt and pale, with eyes that seemed to bore straight into me. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched. Panic surged through me and I broke into a run. My pack thudded against my back, slowing me down, but I didn't dare stop to shed it. The trail twisted and turned, the trees blending into a blur as I sprinted. When I finally reached the parking lot, I nearly sobbed with relief. My car was the only one there. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door. Just as I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, I glanced up. He was there, standing at the edge of the lot, his head tilted slightly as if amused. Then slowly he turned and disappeared back into the trees. I reported the incident to the park rangers, but their response was frustratingly indifferent. They suggested it was a drifter or someone living off the grid, insisting I was never in any real danger. But they didn't see his eyes. They didn't feel the way the air seemed to shift around him, heavy and wrong. I haven't been back to the mountains since. Sometimes late at night, I think about those stacks of stones and wonder what they meant. I think about the man and what might have happened if I hadn't seen him in time. The forest had always been a place of peace for me, but now it's a place of shadows, where something waits just beyond the trees. I still remember the first time I heard about the Halleridge Reserve, a sprawling wilderness tucked away in a forgotten corner of the Pacific Northwest. It wasn't on any major hiking guides or travel blogs, but its mystery drew me in. Something about its reputation as untouched and untamed resonated with me. I was restless, looking for an escape from the monotony of life, and Halleridge promised solitude and raw, unfiltered nature. I wasn't an experienced outdoorsman, but I told myself I could manage. Armed with a borrowed backpack, a basic survival kit, and my old phone for navigation, I set out on what I thought would be a soul-refreshing 2-day trek. The first day was uneventful. The reserve was stunning. The trees towered like ancient sentinels, their branches forming a canopy that dappled the ground with shifting light. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. I felt alive, invigorated even. The trails, however, weren't as welcoming. Roots jutted out unpredictably. The soil was slick with moisture, and certain stretches disappeared altogether into the underbrush. Still, I pressed on. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing by a creek. It seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. As I settled into my tent, the steady burble of the water lulled me into a sense of security. But in the dead of night, I woke with a jolt. At first, I thought the wind was shaking my tent. Then I realized everything outside was still, eerily so. That's when I heard it. A faint, dragging noise like something heavy being pulled through wet grass. "Hello?" I called. my voice barely more than a whisper. No response. I unzipped the tent a fraction and peeked outside. The moonlight illuminated the clearing, and everything appeared undisturbed. Yet the feeling of being watched prickled at my skin. Convinced it was just my imagination, I zipped the tent back up and lay awake, every muscle tense until the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. The next morning I tried to shake off the unease. I told myself it was just nerves, the unfamiliarity of the wilderness playing tricks on me. But the further I walked, the more oppressive the forest felt. The air grew colder, heavier, and the trail seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. By mid-afternoon, a dense fog rolled in, swallowing the path ahead. My phone's GPS faltered, the signal blinking in and out. That's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible through the haze. Relief flooded me. "Hey! Over here!" I shouted, waving frantically. But the figure didn't react. It just stood there, motionless, its silhouette blurred by the fog. "Are you okay?" I called again, taking a hesitant step forward. As I moved closer, the figure seemed to fade, dissolving into the mist. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced to make sense of what I'd just seen, or thought I'd seen, but no explanation came. That night I made camp early, too shaken to continue. I built a fire, the crackling flames offering a fragile sense of safety. But as darkness fell, every noise, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made my heart pound. Just after midnight, the sound came again. That dragging noise, closer this time. Gripping the small knife I'd packed, I stepped out of the tent. The firelight flickered against the surrounding trees, casting long, shifting shadows. And then I saw them, footprints in the damp earth, circling my tent. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The only response was the soft crackle of the dying fire. My flashlight's beam darted through the clearing, revealing nothing but empty woods. But as I turned, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow slipping between the trees, too fast to be natural. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I packed up and started walking, desperate to find my way back. My phone was dead, and I was running dangerously low on water. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the towering trees pressing in from all sides. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I stumbled into a group of scouts and their guide. They must have seen the panic in my eyes because they didn't ask many questions. They gave me water, and I muttered something about being lost. Later, when a ranger arrived, I tried to explain what had happened, but my story sounded absurd even to me. But a few days after I returned home, I came across an online forum discussing strange occurrences in Halleridge, stories of abandoned campsites, eerie noises at night, and shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. I don't know what I encountered out there. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild, or maybe some places are better left untouched. One thing's for sure, I'll never set foot in Halleridge Reserve again.